Chris Sharrett. You work on a book on sacrificial impact, and you have an interest in apocalyptic dystopias, or how can I phrase it? Fantasy,
Well, I guess it comes down to that in some ways, or Fonda Millennium, as Arthur Coker coins it, maybe. But I've been interested for some time in the idea of apocalyptic consciousness as a kind of a formative framework for American consciousness overall. But my reading of postmodern culture right now is concerned with this idea that culture is caught between myth and history. Refuses actually both. There is a distaste for myth as being, risible, as being something that's kind of kitsch and outdated. Yet there's a kind of a panicked attempt to bring back myth, and I use as a model, well, a certain kind of a model, I guess, Joseph Campbell's certain popularity now. I see this kind of nostalgia for myth showing up in the retro mode of postmodern society that people like Frederick Jameson speak of, the kind of nostalgia culture, the anniversary culture, where we have anniversaries for everything from Jack the Ripper to Woodstock to the moon landing to the Kennedy assassination. It's tied up in a certain kind of a nostalgia for myth, for a kind of mythic view of reality. But yet there's a refusal of that. I mean, there's a tendency to send up myth. There's a tendency, for example, in the anniversaries about Kennedy, you see concurrent with the release of the autopsy photos, for example, and this kind of mournful deliberation over the evisceration of Kennedy. You see a different kind of evisceration in the tabloid culture, which is a way of taking the old Freudian notion of the totem system, the idea of a patriarchal society, and really turning it upside down, inside out, but yet not refusing it. There is, I think, if you can say this in a capsulized way, there's a tendency to hold on to the master narratives of myth, the idea of the Oedipal construct, the idea of patriarchy, the idea of the charismatic hero, the idea of charismatic authority, I mean, the things which have really driven the West, which began to come apart, I use as a kind of, if it's possible to really periodize postmodern civilization, I would put it someplace around the Holocaust and around World War II, when the cameras were turned on to the whole business of charismatic authority. Like the cameras, weren't there to capture Alexander and Napoleon, but they were there to capture Hitler and to capture what it means to invest so much into the idea of heteronomy, the idea of abrogating individual will onto some charismatic other. So I think there's a great nostalgia for that culture, the culture of myth, but yet it's finally seen as being outdated. Yet civilization isn't prepared to cross over into history, because history smacks too much of certain kinds of implications, like socialism. Some kind of historical materialist view of reality is really seen also as being contemptible, or something that's really not plausible or acceptable. So there is this really tense dialectic, or it's not really a dialectic in any true sense, but a very tense opposition between myth and history. And if we see this kind of formulation showing up in other situations, like if we refer to certain forms of anthropology, sort of like mainstream early forms of anthropology or mythography, like the works of James Frazer, you can look at Durkheim or any scholar perhaps inside this area, Levi-Strauss. When the will to meaning, when meaning under mythic consciousness is suddenly threatened, what do you do? I mean, to create a consensus, I mean, to create some new sense of meaning, since we don't believe in this thing, like the idea of the father figure, the idea of charismatic authority. What do we do then? Well, according to most studies, and of course you have different methodologies here, but I think a good point of reference right now is the critic and anthropologist René Girard, who speaks about the idea of the institution of meaning when mythic meaning is actually threatened. The attempt is to find a new other, to create a new dichotomy between self and other, to create new forms of tribal warfare. I mean, to really designate a new other and then build a new totemic system and then reinstitute myth. And myth, of course, is threatened by all kinds of processes, which we see happening right now, I think, in terms of the enunciation of myth, the repetition of myth, the kind of washing out of myth. It's too repeated. It's turned into something finally, I'd say, besides myth. It becomes a pure narrative. It becomes a story that's really kind of silly, and it's really set up. So the attempt is to create or to bring back myth through a clear self-other dichotomy that's established through sacrificial violence. I mean, through warfare, through traditional acts of sacrifice, and also through scapegoating. Like, you find some other to designate as a scapegoat, that person is sacrificed. There is a new sense of evil. There's a new consensus then coming from that process. And then you bring back myth gradually. Like, you begin to create a new pantheon of heroes, villains, whatever. If that process itself fails, the sacrificial mechanism that's called scapegoating, which goes back to Fraser and shows up in Freud. I mean, it's sort of a old formulation now, but I think Girard has a new take on it. When that process becomes dysfunctional, when scapegoating can't really operate, when the trials of someone like Ted Bundy or Robert Chambers or the Nussbaum Steinberg trial, there are all kinds of scapegoating functions. So Noriega is a new demon. Soviets were a demon. Now they're no longer quite so problematical, at least for the time being. Or at least, like, the Soviets are being turned into Americans, in terms of their popular culture now, whatever. But if the scapegoating function doesn't work, you have a situation of what Girard calls sacrificial violence. Sacrificial crisis, rather, where the sacrifice becomes omnidirectional. The individual scapegoating act can't work because the scapegoat is not seen as what the scapegoat should be, which is a kind of aberration, a kind of distinct evil, which once it's expunged can bring back consensus again. To me, the kind of primal scene of this in my lifetime sort of is the Watergate situation when Gerald Ford came on television after Nixon stepped down and said, "Our long national nightmare is over." I mean, the whole language there suggests that this was an aberration, when it was so clearly seen as otherwise. That people intuited, at least, the fact that Watergate was a symptom of a profound crisis within the structure of American politics. And that was also, I think, one more straw to break the camel's back of charismatic authority, the idea of the imperial presidency and all the implications there. But I think the point is that the scapegoating act doesn't work. And that propels a thing which we call now sacrificial America. I mean, it causes us, I think, to look back and see what's happened in this country with the premises of generative violence, the premises which have helped to create meaning, and premises which call for bloodletting. I mean, we're doing a book that deals with how central generative violence is within American culture, depending on people also like Richard Slotkin and people in American studies too. But we're taking that work up to the present day, up to this thing called postmodern civilization, to look at various symptoms of sacrificial crisis, a kind of free-form violence, whether it's a kind of a vague, panicked, anxious schadenfreude, this kind of combined ecstasy and panic over the suffering of others, or whether it's the kind of free-form violence of, say, gang warfare, or the assault rifle culture, the kind of a suicidal, cynical nihilism of people who understand that the will to meaning under myth is over with. It's a culture that's really locked into madness, really, because the fact that it cannot see past myth, it can't see beyond the idea of meaning constructed under myth into something new, some other kind of a possibility.